Welcome, fellow horror hounds. Welcome to Talk and Stalk. This is the very first episode of what is planned on being an ongoing series where we're going to discuss the wonderful world of horror. I'm Barry. This is my corrupt co-host, fellow friend and film buff, Samuel.
Hiya, folks. Thank you very much, Barry. And thank you to the viewer, to the listener, for partaking us into our deep, dark descent into one of the greatest genres in cinema. We'll be looking at some of the most infamous titles, some of the films with great cult followings, the unseen, and even the obscene.
Very glad to finally get this ball rolling, to be quite honest. Me and you have known each other for nearly 3 years now. Obviously, we did work together, didn't we, for a little while?
Oh, yeah, definitely. The introduction was so sudden. However, it just clicked right off, almost like within a matter of seconds. My goodness, the commonalities were ridiculous.
Yeah, only took a few minutes of conversing, didn't it? And then we quickly come to realise that, yeah, we've both got a profound passion for cinema. Horror in general. I mean, you know, I've had a profound passion for cinema since I was a teenager. But horror, I would say horror's certainly my favourite genre. I'd say it's probably yours as well, isn't it?
Oh, yeah. The irony is that if you met me about 10, maybe 15 years ago, like, the genre was not on my radar. It had no interest to me whatsoever. However, through certain titles, it changed my life. You would never have guessed I never liked it.
Yeah, I mean, the thing is, for me, instead of watching things like Sesame Street and The Muppet Show as a kid, I was watching the likes of Nightmare on Elm Street, Night of the Living Dead, and American Werewolf in London. And, you know, these films just got me hooked. They provided, as Wes Craven once said it, horror movies provide a safe scare.
Joe, I'm glad you brought up Wes Craven, actually, because it was actually one of his films that's in the list that we'll be talking about shortly had such a profound impact on me. Like, you know, when you dare yourself to watch more and more depraved stuff. I remember watching The Evil Dead. That was the film that changed my life forever. However, The Last House on the Left, the uncut version, wow, yeah. That was something.
Yeah. Well, today's we're going to get the ball rolling anyway. We've got quite a lot to get through here. Our topic of discussion, actually, I thought, because I'm basically popping my podcast cherry here. So yeah, this is all kind of new to me. But our topic of discussion for the first podcast is going to be 70s horror films, our top 10. Now, I think that you'd actually agree with me here, Samuel, that the 70s was actually a great decade for horror.
Arguably, in some cases, you could say it's the golden age of horror. I mean, so many, pioneers, so many game changers as well. I think John Carpenter pointed out in a documentary, Nightmares Red, White and Blue, as the culture changed from the 60s to the 70s, everything got harder. There's more sex, there's more violence, there's a lot more perverse stuff. And my goodness, the 70s was a great example of that. However, some real game changers that changed the face of the genre forever.
Yep, certainly. It was a very transformative era for horror. I think it was there's a lot of movies within this time period that have gone on to attain cult and critical status. Also, just to preface, there's obviously going to be some great and very good 70s horror films that haven't actually made our top 10. But that's only really because that's no disrespect to them. It's only because it's so hard to condense to just 10 films, but we've actually put in a few honourable mentions as well. Maybe a few of which, maybe there's a few films on this list that probably some people, a lot of listeners probably haven't heard of, that I think probably deserve a little more attention. But so looking forward to getting this going, and we'll start with the honourable mentions, Samuel. The first of which for me is 1976's The Tenant, directed by and starring Roman Polanski. Now, I don't think this is a film you've seen, is it?
No, it's one of Polanski's films that I haven't been able to get around to. You're a big zealot about it.
I'm a huge fan of psychological horror. I like films that are very cerebral. I like films that blur the lines between fantasy and reality, and The Tenant is definitely a film that does that. It's the third and final film in what Polanski called his apartment trilogy. the first of which being 65's Repulsion, obviously followed by 1968's Rosemary's Baby, which is obviously the most well-known of the three and widely regarded as being one of the best psychological horror films of all time. The Tenant is a film, unfortunately, I think that was completely overshadowed by them two films, and really got very little in the way of attention upon release. It has developed somewhat of a small cult status over the years, but it's a very creepy, very claustrophobic movie that really kind of explores a man's descent into madness. It's certainly a slow-burning psychological horror film that, yeah, I definitely think deserves more attention. So, what's the first film for your honourable mentions?
Well, in 1972, we had ourselves three fascinating films. We had, as mentioned previously, Wes Craven's The Last House on the Left. We had John Waters' exploitation film Pink Flamingos, and the honourable mention for me is The Gore Girls, directed by Herschel Gordon Lewis, known as the Godfather of Gore. This was intended to be his swan song. Now, some of that is because he saw the climate of the films that are being made, and because of the more grisly content that was coming out, it was becoming, satirized. It was oversaturated to the point of where, it didn't have the same shock effect. Now, I know some people mostly prefer The Wizard of Gore, but with the Gore Girls, it's silly. It's so silly that I can't believe people would get offended by it. It's still banned in Australia, I believe. However, I can't say it's well directed. I can't say it's well written. It's got a couple of good performances, and the gore is very satisfying.
Spoken like a true sadist there. I'll admit, I'll hold my hands up and admit it's not a film I've seen. I kind of feel ashamed, actually. So, in a way, would you say it's kind of a guilty pleasure? You kind of appreciate it's not a great horror film, but it's a film that you love.
Oh, most certainly. I think I could easily classify my top 5 favourite Herschel Gordon Lewis's films. It's not necessarily the most important, nor is it the best made. However, I could easily have in the guilty pleasures alongside, say, Necromantic 2. It's easily a guilty pleasure of mine.
Okay. Yeah, Necromantic 2 is certainly an acquired taste as well, isn't it?
We'll talk about that in the future, though.
Yeah, we'll save that for a later podcast. The next honourable mention for me is once again a psychological horror film. Again, it's a film that there's a lot of people out there that it's not a very well-known film, in fact, and it was released in 1978, and it's Magic, directed by none other than Richard Attenborough, starring Anthony Hopkins, long before he took on the role of Hannibal Lecter in Silence of the Lambs. Magic is, to me, an effectively creepy film. Again, it's not a horror movie per se, but again, it's a film with a very psychological component to it. And I've got to say this, the movie actually had what is probably, or certainly one of the scariest trailers ever. From what I know, the original trailer in 1978 was actually pulled off cinemas because too many people actually found it disturbing. It actually gave some people nightmares. It's a movie that explores dissociative identity disorder, which again is a theme used in horror that I've always found to be somewhat unnerving and pretty disturbing. It's basically about a ventriloquist who, the dummy that he has in this film, Fats, is, I would say, the creepiest dummy that's ever been put to film. I believe you've seen Magic, haven't you?
It's one that I think I wasn't aware of it until you brought it up in a very zealous manner. And then actually getting around to it, the doll did creep me out a little bit. You said something about Anthony Hopkins.
Yeah. He was the dummy itself was actually modelled on Anthony Hopkins, and Anthony Hopkins was actually so creeped out by Fats the dummy that he almost left the film. He refused to do it. Richard Attenborough had to do some arm twisting and to get him to stay on for the movie. The score by Jerry Goldsmith perfectly complements the film as well. I've got to say that the score's very creepy. There's a great sense of atmosphere to the film. Okay, well, we'll move on to your second honourable mention.
I think Hammer definitely needs to be mentioned. It's the last few years of the first few years of the 70s was a bit of an awkward time for Hammer. However, it's got to go to Hands of the Ripper from 1971. It's a nice little twist on the heavily mythologized legacy of Jack the Ripper. It's got a nice little possession element to it as well. If you saw the posters for when it was released, there's a weirdly subtle titillating selling point where you have the Ripper's hands about to grab a screaming woman, but where his hands are a little, a little cheeky, you could say. And it had a profound effect on me. I think it was one of the better later produced Hammer films. I still think it's relatively effective. It may be low production cost, but production value's always been pretty good with Hammer films.
Yeah, I'm a big Hammer fan, I will confess. I haven't seen Hands of the Ripper for a long time. I saw that film at quite a young age, actually, and it definitely needs a rewatch. I think the golden years of Hammer were very much the 1950s and 60s. That was certainly one of the later Hammer entries. But yeah, from what I've read, etc., it's definitely one of the stronger entries from from kind of the tail end of Hammer, if you will.
But that doesn't necessarily, sadly, say very much, considering Countess Dracula wasn't necessarily all that very good. I think was it Dr. Jekyll and Sister Hyde again. I think came around that time as well, and they were both. Yeah. The latter was watchable, but Countess Dracula was very meek.
Yeah, based on Elizabeth Bathory, Hungarian, wasn't she? I think the first Hammer film I ever saw was 1958's Dracula. That was the very first. Peter Cushing, Christopher Lee, two horror icons in that film. I think that was probably the first ever Hammer film that I actually watched. And shall we? All right, third honourable mention. Now, this is a film that I actually think is one of the best horror movie remakes out there. Some would actually say it's arguably better than the 1956 version. I certainly think it's not far off it, and that's 1978's Invasion of the Body Snatchers.
Very good choice.
I think is a very good remake. I think the original is a sci-fi classic, certainly. I've always found it a scary film. There's no jump scares or anything like that. It's the theme of the movie, the loss of identity, the whole paranoia aspect, that we're being taken over by beings who replicate human beings. Obviously, there's a famous film from the 80s we're not going to go into that does a very similar thing. Great cast, Donald Sutherland, Jeff Goldblum's in there, Veronica Cartwright, even Leonard Nimoy, years after playing Spock. I think Invasion of the Body Snatchers is a very well-made remake. Obviously, there was another remake in the 90s, directed by Abel Ferrara, nowhere near as good as the first two, and I like the fact that Kevin McCarthy, the lead star in the original, actually got a cameo in this as well. I actually thought that was kind of a nice little nod. What's your thoughts on Invasion of the Body Snatchers?
It is one of the very few cases in which horror remakes, is very much well done. I think because the original one, some have seen it as sort of commentary or an allegory for the fear of communism, which of course was prominent during during that decade. With this, though, the loss of identity, I think, is more played up. Whether or not the themes of fear of communism is as prominent, the loss of identity, I think, is more terrifying, and I think it is extremely well executed. In fact, you have that scene with it is Kiefer Sutherland who's pointing and he's screaming. Right?
Oh, it's Donald Sutherland. Kiefer's dad, and
it is Kiefer's.
That's what I was going to say. Actually, it's a gut punch of an ending. It's a bleak ending, and it's one that stays with you. Very, very good ending. Good little twist there. I'm sorry, I do apologise to anyone that probably hasn't seen it. I've kind of ruined the film there. I do apologise. But yeah, Invasion of the Body Snatchers, I think, is a really good 70s horror flick. What's your third and final? Oh no, hang on a sec. Your third and final is actually on my top 10, isn't it?
Yeah, so we'll save that for when the time comes, so when we get onto your top 10 list as well, because I think there's a lot that we could both discuss with that.
Okay, so we're actually moving into kind of the top 10 films now. There's actually a few films on this list that are in my top 10 that aren't in Samuel's, and vice versa. But I do believe there's quite a few films that are the same. So, yeah, jumping into my first, I'd actually put this in the number 10 spot. I know this isn't a film that you're overly that keen on. I know a lot of people that aren't, actually, but it's 1973's Don't Look Now, Donald Sutherland and Julie Christie. I actually think Don't Look Now is a great example of a slow-burning psychological horror film. I think that its great emphasis is on atmosphere and tone, and there's just a sense of dread that permeates that movie. At its core, it's really a film about grief, and Sutherland and Julie Christie are perfect in the roles. You can really feel the grief that they're going through in this movie, and I think that Venice actually makes a perfect, suitably creepy setting for the film as well. It's definitely a film that manages to be, in a way, kind of beautiful but haunting at the same time. Again, it has a very kind of creepy score, and the climax to this movie actually terrified me as a child, and it took me many years to actually find out what that film was. I feel like it has one of the most iconic horror endings in the history of horror. If I remember rightly, you're not that keen on Don't Look Now.
Well, I can't. It's not necessarily. I'm not as as a fan of it as you are. I guess it's just a film I think I need to rewatch. I think it was a film that I watched, I think, at a bad time, so I wasn't able to really fully appreciate it. I understand, I know some other colleagues who are almost as bigger fans as you are with it. However, I it's one of those films where, okay, it deserves a second chance. I've not been able to sit down to do so. I don't give many second chances this time. I need to.
Yeah, I think it's certainly, like two of the other films that I've mentioned, The Tenant and Magic, I think it is an acquired taste. It's a very slow-burning horror film, psychological horror movie. It is actually very layered. It's more layered than what first appears to be as well. And I would definitely, without a doubt, say that it is a movie that actually probably requires more than one viewing as well. It's very well put together and, very well directed by Nicholas Roeg. But yeah, it's really the atmosphere and the tone, just that sense of dread throughout the film that really makes me appreciate that movie. Okay, what's your first film on your list that I haven't got?
Well, if we were to rank it in 10, this would be at the bottom at number 10. I think it's because it's Theatre of Blood. So it's with Vincent Price. That to me is that is the great, one of the greatest sales points ever. Made in 1973, directed by Douglas Hijux. My apologies if I didn't pronounce that right. It's about, now there are some incredible Vincent Price performances. However, the ones that are the best are those that he's so, he's been so eager to take on such a role. Like when you go back to The Fall of the House of Usher, directed by Roger Corman. He was so committed to that performance, with making sure that his makeup, his costume, and his mannerisms were absolutely right. This time round, Vincent Price is a Shakespearean actor who's out for vengeance against a group of critics who essentially, humiliated him and drove him to the point of attempting suicide. Okay, so his enthusiasm is right there. It's both in. Vincent Price has that. He can be equally as intimidating as he is so engaging and so hammy. But yet, it's not hammy where it damages the performance. You just go, that's brilliant. And in terms of a personal significance for Vincent Price, it's where he met his wife, Coral Brown. So, for me, it's a significant chapter in Price's career, and it's the one I have revisited so frequently.
And I'm actually ashamed to admit this. I've never actually seen it in its entirety, and I am actually a big Vincent Price fan. I mean, he is one of the biggest horror icons in the history of cinema, without a doubt. That man has over 200 acting credits to his name. Obviously, I love House of Wax, William Castle's 1959 House on Haunted Hill, The Abominable Dr. Phibes. I mean, this man has so many great film roles. But I've never actually seen it. I need to. I actually saw it on Blu-ray in the shop today, and I'll be honest, I was actually tempted in picking it up.
Coulda, shoulda, woulda, it's all part of life's sweet sorrow.
Yeah.
He did a film in the 40s called Laura, which again, which was another film where he had it's not horror, it's a drama. It is a drama, but his supporting role is absolutely incredible. So he has himself a nice diversity. And let's not forget as well, this is a man who would also voice in Disney as well. His career stretches all kinds of decades.
Yeah, he voiced Prince Ratigan in Basil the Great Mouse Detective, didn't he? In 86.
Yeah.
And I think the last film of his career, certainly the last theatrically released film, I'm pretty certain, was Edward Scissorhands in 1990.
What a swan song. What an absolute swan song.
Certainly a distinctive voice. He actually did obviously the narration. His voice was heard in Michael Jackson's Thriller, the music video as well. The man had such a distinctive, commanding voice.
I think the one film that I almost put on the list was Scream and Scream Again, because it has the three horror icons, Price, Christopher Lee, and Peter Cushing all in the same film. That was an absolute gift. Whereas this one, he's racking it up to 11 out of 10. You could see that it's one of his most definitive performances.
Oh yes, certainly. Okay, well, I'm going to move on to the next film on the list now. Now, this is a film that is arguably Dario Argento's finest work, released in 1977, and that is Suspiria, from the Italian master of horror. I mean, Argento is one of the biggest names in Italian horror, without a doubt. Suspiria. Now, this is a film that, unlike most of Argento's other films, isn't actually a giallo. There's giallo elements to it. I mean, it's more a supernatural horror film, but there's even some slasher elements to it. But I think what makes Suspiria stand out, the movie has this very kind of dreamlike quality to it. It kind of feels like a dream, but strangely a nightmare at the same time. It's a film that Argento uses colour to great effect in this film. It really does have some striking visuals. And the score, I think the score is just one of the greatest scores in the history of horror. Obviously done by Goblin, who actually scored quite a few of Argento's films. Personally, this is my favourite score by Goblin. It's just a great... what's your thoughts on it? I know that you like Suspiria, don't you?
Well, like I say, even if it's not on the list, I do not underestimate the power of that film. I first saw it. Not even I first saw it. My first cinematic experience was at the Celluloid Screams Film Festival a couple of years ago, and wow. As you said, with the colouring and Goblin score, Goblin actually did a live score for Deep Red a couple of years beforehand, back in 2015, I believe.
Yeah.
So part of me thought, if this is what it's like for Deep Red, imagine what Suspiria would have been with hearing a live scoring of it. Like I said, I think Tenebrae, I slightly prefer, but at no point does that mean that I think it's a better film. Suspiria, I think it is mind-boggling. Yet amazing. Thankfully, it didn't have too much issues with censorship in Britain, but I think that in itself is a different story.
Yeah, I think, I mean, personally, there's a lot of people, there seems to be a big kind of, almost a 50-50, really. You could kind of line up a lot of Argento fans. What's your favourite film? I think Deep Red and Suspiria are generally considered, I mean, like you said, I think Tenebrae is really good. I like Tenebrae. I liked Bird with a Crystal Plumage, which was actually his directorial debut. I thought that was quite a debut. But yeah, Suspiria's always been my my favourite Argento movie, closely followed by Deep Red, actually. Okay, what's the next film on your list?
Oh, this one's a nice little niche of a doozy. It's a West German horror film based on in 1970. It's called Mark of the Devil, directed by Michael Armstrong and Adrian Hoven. Well, so to speak. There was huge production complications with that film. Adrian Hoven wanted it one way, but Michael Armstrong was brought in, and there are some scenes that were supposed to be shot that were never introduced. So Michael Armstrong had an ending in mind, but it never came to be. So we have ourselves Udo Kier in a very young performance, in a very young role as this apprentice to the Witchfinder, who we'll talk about very shortly. And that's a really surreal thought to think of, a film with a young Udo Kier. When you consider his filmography, he's another one whose career stretches about at least 200. I think some of his most recent films with The Editor, the homage to Giallo films, as well as Lars von Trier's Nymphomaniac as a waiter. But and then you've got yourself Herbert Lohm, who plays as Lord Cumberland, as this witchfinder. But if you see his cane, you realise, aha, I know who he is. It's a very subtle thing, but it's a nice little giveaway. If you know your history with certain notorious individuals, you realise who he really is. So why did I choose this film? Most of it is to do with its incredible history with censorship. It's so released in 1970. It went through various different directors of the British Board of Film Censors. It went through John Trevelyan, who really didn't like it, cut it to bits. Stephen Murphy, from 1971 to 75. He so in the early 70s, Clockwork Orange, Straw Dogs, The Exorcist, The Devils, Last Tango in Paris. Most of these films were passed almost uncut with minor cuts. The distributor said, "Could you release this, please?" Stephen Murphy essentially went, "No, you've got to cut it." And it was only released uncut in 2013. So I think its score is beautiful. It's this it has some very unpleasant themes about the exploitation of power, the manipulation of man, as well as, state normalizing such harsh punishments for supposed witchcraft.
Yeah. I'm going to embarrass myself here and say I know the film. I've never actually watched it. I know you probably want to strangle me right now. But
it's not for everyone. The thing is, it's niche, and unless you're severely desensitized, the violence in it is horrible. I mean, authentic torture methods and actual torture devices, these were actually authentic as well. Yeah. It's not necessarily easy going, but there is some weird beauty to it. As I said, with the score.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely. I need to put it on the watch list. I mean, there's still a lot. I've seen a hell of a lot of horror films over the years, but there's still films that have kind of escaped me, and I haven't actually got round to watching. And I think that's probably a film that I will have to put on the list. On to the next film. Now, horror doesn't really get more mainstream than this, to be honest. Released in 1976, it was actually it was Stephen King's first novel to ever actually be made into a film, and still to this day, I still think it's one of the best adaptations, and that's Carrie, directed by Brian De Palma. Big name Hollywood director. I mean, this is a guy that's covered so many genres. I mean, after Carrie, he Dressed to Kill, Scarface, The Untouchables, Mission Impossible. But Carrie is really the film that made him. I mean, he directed Sisters, which came out 4 years prior to this. But Carrie is the film that kind of put him on that Hollywood map almost. I think it's wonderfully directed, actually, by De Palma. I think it's got a great score. I think Sissy Spacek and Pippa Laurie were perfectly cast in this film, actually, both of which were deservedly Oscar nominated for their roles in this film. You got PJ Souls in there in a small role. She starred in Halloween a couple of years later, and Nancy Allen, who went on to star in another Brian De Palma film, Dressed to Kill, 4 years later. I just think Carrie is kind of less of a horror film. It's kind of a coming-of-age film as well. It's, you know, Stephen King has actually said he doesn't actually see it as a horror movie per se, and it's more a coming-of-age film. I just think it's so well directed. The score, it's got almost a dreamlike quality to it as well in many scenes. And, you know, the prom scene, I think, is probably one of the most well-known and famous horror scenes, you know, in history. Notable for starring John Travolta in his first film role as well. I didn't really think that much of the 2013 remake. It was watchable. It was okay in that, but what's your thoughts on Carrie?
Oh, it's easily my favourite adaptation. It's up for me. It's up there with Stand By Me.
Okay.
I think in terms of Stephen King adaptations, I first saw it in a double bill with another film that's in your top 10 list, which we'll talk about shortly, and it had such a profound effect. I just thought, like, it's one of those films that actually I find difficulty finding a fault with it, and in a way that unlike the 2013 remake, which like bothered me. Not that I think it was terrible. It was just the flaws in it felt more obvious. Whereas with Brian De Palma's take on it, you know, what an introduction to bringing Stephen King onto the big screen.
Yeah, I mean, the character of Carrie, Sissy Spacek's Carrie, was so sympathetic. You can't help but the casting was perfect. And Pippa Laurie as a religious zealot mother, I actually thought the scene, and it always has an impact on me, the scene where she actually kills her mother with the knives and she's like Jesus on the cross. That scene is just, you know, there's a lot of obviously religious symbolism there. I just think that scene is just incredible. And not to mention it gave us a jump scare ending that I'm sure got a lot of popcorn flying in the cinema back in 76, which so much so that I think Sean Cunningham for Friday the 13th was like, do you know what, we want to do that. We want a jump scare ending for our film. And in construction, they're very similar. It's, you know, you're kind of led to believe that, you know, it's a happy little ending, everything's right, and then you get the jump scare. And in a way, Sean Cunningham, kind of recycled it for Friday the 13th, which again was another great kind of jump scare ending. But yeah, I still think Carrie's one of the very best. Obviously, Misery up there as well, but that will be for a much later podcast. What's the next film on your list?
I was tossing internally between these two particular films, but I think the next film, it has to be very significant, very problematic, very, very divisive. Miyazaki's debut, I Spit on Your Grave, or originally titled Day of the Woman. Yeah. Now, a lot of revenge films became prominent in the 1970s. I think the most popular one, I'm not necessarily talking about rape and revenge per se. I mean, that in itself became a subgenre of exploitation later on. But like with Michael Winner's Death Wish, in, I think it was 1974, it popularized the idea of revenge. You also had films like Rolling Thunder, Death Weekend, Lipstick, that came about. Some of these were in the 70s, some of these came out in the 80s. But in the late 70s, I Spit Your Grave was a film that repulsed a lot of people. I mean, first of all, but it's had a history of where people have looked back and gone, hang on, there is something here worth talking about. For starters, Camille Keaton's performance, I think, is very good. She plays off the sweet girl next door persona, absolutely lovely and caring, very uncanny with, you know, wanting to press forward with writing her first book as well. The scenes of violence are absolutely almost unwatchable. I almost walked out when I first saw it in the cinema because the screaming was so piercing, it felt so real. But one of the biggest problems with the remake that came about in 2011 was that the violence towards Jennifer Hills, the character in both films, was too realistic. But the violence that she would inflict on her aggressors was almost cartoon-like. I call it like Tom and Jerry-esque. Whereas with the original, the revenge sequences were so real. But I think it's not a well-made film. However, it's important and it has personal significance for me because I wrote a paper on it some years back and it changed my sort of academic career, if you like. So I acknowledge the fact that it has problems. However, they're worth talking about. And I think that shows, after all these years, like 42 years later, it still has a punch.
Yeah, it's actually the first film on your list I have seen. I have actually seen it a couple of times. Admittedly, it has been years. It was very quickly labelled a video nasty, wasn't it? And, it's kind of easy to see why. It caused a hell of a lot of controversy due to the subject matter, etc. But yeah, it was really within a time period as well that a lot of kind of exploitation films and that were being churned out left, right and centre. I haven't actually seen the remake. But
I wouldn't waste your time with it personally.
My fiance actually did purchase it today. I don't know if we're going to watch it together. I don't know because typically it's not my kind of movie. But we'll see.
To be upfront about it though, unless you mind about it, you will be watching the censored version.
Oh yeah, probably, which probably be better for me. But, okay. Well, the next film on the list is probably a horror film that doesn't really need any introduction, and that is 1973's The Exorcist, which is obviously the granddaddy of demonic possession films. Obviously, I think it's kind of easy to see why it did cause a huge impact when it came out. Obviously, very controversial for its time, but the highest-grossing horror film for a long time, until the release of It just 3 years ago. I think The Exorcist for me, for a film that's nearly 47 years old, it still holds up remarkably well. I think it's really well directed by William Friedkin. And, it was a film that, it made quite an impact. And I know that apparently there were priests lining up outside cinemas blessing people when they left, and there was a lot of promotion for it. There was a lot of publicity and marketing, word of mouth, and all that. People were throwing up and people were passing out, etc. I still think it's a really good horror film. Could I say it's like overrated? There's a lot of people out there that say it's an overrated horror film, and I can kind of understand that. I suppose I try and take myself to the period of when it came out and the impact it caused, etc. What's your thoughts on The Exorcist?
Well, I mean, this was the third honourable mention. Now, because I think it's a film that I've watched multiple times. I remember watching it, I think so far I've watched it about 8 times. And it's beautifully made. And it's tested the time. And it's the film that, it put Hammer out of business because they went, we can't top this. And rightfully so. It's had an incredible history, all the kind of mythology behind it. But for me, though, it's just... This might kind of a bit contradictory. I'm not necessarily the biggest person when it comes to the supernatural horror, and to see sort of the pinnacle, all of it, I will not forget its power and its significance. It just didn't have that sort of effect on me. So on the one hand, I may not necessarily be seeing it in rose-tinted glasses, but on the other hand, I'm hoping that I'm not tainted by the idea of it's overrated, because I don't necessarily think it's overrated. I do think it's one of those few films that deserves its legacy. I'm just not affected by it in the way that most audiences have been.
Okay, no, that's fair enough. I mean, it's always been. I saw it at quite a young age, actually. Well, say quite young age. I was late teens, and kind of a nerd. There's one scene in particular, actually, that still gets to me, and that's the the crucifixion scene, if you know what I mean. I won't go into obviously detail and whatever, but yeah, that scene always kind of makes me cringe in that. I think Mike Oldfield's Tubular Bells fits the film well as well. Obviously, that become famous because of The Exorcist. I definitely think it played a hugely important role in the horror genre. Okay, what's the next movie on your list?
This is the Overground directorial debut of a filmmaker that we both very much admire, that you rightfully touched on earlier. It is Wes Craven's The Last House on the Left.
Okay.
My first proper experience of the film was watching it in 35mm as an event series back in 2014. But at the time, I didn't realise it was a censored version. So when I watched it again on the big screen a year later, there was an added scene where the lead girl, she's having Krug carved into her chest, and the reaction I gave, I think some of the audience members could actually see that. It caught me completely off guard. A lot of people have compared this to the Ingmar Bergman film The Virgin Spring in terms of the revenge story, if you like. But what's amazing, though, is that its cultural significance and the way that so many film critics have gone out to defend the film. I mean, you've got Kim Newman, an incredible encyclopedia in terms of horror. He's been an adamant defender of the film. Roger Ebert, a film critic, who himself was not the biggest horror fan. My goodness, he was a quite big defender of this film for quite a long time. In a way, I mean, there's some bits of acting that are a little bit off. Some people don't like the juxtaposition between the seedy, nasty, scenes of torment by the gang, and then it suddenly cuts to the idiotic police officers who come across as like Laurel and Hardy in some ways, but just not as funny.
Yeah.
So it is an important film, and it's had such an impact on me. I think for Wes Craven, I think. It's interesting. I mean, it's interesting to think that, this is the man who would change horror so many times. I mean, a decade later, he would give us Freddy Krueger, which, of course, his surname's linking on to the boss of the gang, David Hess's character Krug. So, it's one of those films that it's even if you don't like it, you have to understand and even better accept. It represented a cultural time in the early 70s, a very angry time, but it also was the starting point for one of the most important filmmakers, American filmmakers.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, his directorial debut, like you said, and Sean Cunningham worked on it, didn't he, as producer before he went on to direct Friday the 13th. 8 years later. It's like you say, I think, it played an important part in exploitation cinema. Putting Wes Craven on the map, and it's a film that even, I mean, what is that? Nearly 50 years ago, it still holds a pretty raw power, because it was 1972 that came out. What did you think? Just very quick thoughts on the 2009 remake.
It was mainstream.
Okay.
Yeah, that's all I can say. It was. I found it relatively toothless. I say I find it toothless. I found it slightly more watchable than the Ice Be on Your Grave remake that came about like a year later.
Yeah.
However, what's depressing though is the fact of it shows that these films, are so popularized or sort of getting such a status that they're having to be remade for popular culture. I'm just like. No.
Yeah, I don't.
They miss the point. I feel like they do miss the point as well with the way it ends.
Yeah, I don't think any genre out there has had more remakes actually than horror. But not one of the worst remakes, not one of the best. But yeah, I've certainly seen a lot worse. But yeah, like you said, kind of mainstream. The next film on the list is a film from 1974. It actually predates Halloween by 4 years, and that's Black Christmas.
Hey.
This is a film that we both really like. It's very much a proto-slasher, isn't it? I mean, the slasher genre had not been fully forged at this point.
And of course, 1974 Borders is another film that could be classed as a parody slasher, which we'll talk about later. However, the POV shot is very, very unsettling. I think the one time you actually saw something like that was in Michael Powell's Peeping Tom back in 1960. However, the way this is done is that you're seeing it through the eyes of the killer. That's horrible. Like, really is horrible. Some of the sound effects. Not to mention, we've had some arguments about the film's ending as well.
Yeah, I think Black Christmas is it's a film that's it certainly developed somewhat more of a cult following now among horror fans. Black Christmas is a pretty well-known film now, and deservedly so. Obviously, it didn't have the commercial success that Halloween had or anything. But yeah, you're right. I think that film it's atmospheric, it's claustrophobic. I think that the telephone calls that the killer makes in that film are actually pretty disturbing. And there's a great air of mystery to the movie, is you actually see very little of the killer. And that's, I'm a big fan of less is more, and you don't really see much of the killer at all in that film. And yeah, when you talk about, the ending, obviously, we're not going to say the ending in case people haven't seen it, but I like the ending. I like how it ends. And it's a film, really, that kind of plays on the whole urban legend as well, the killer's inside the house. Like When a Stranger Calls did years later in 1979, which had obviously become a pretty popular urban legend, I think first starting in the 1960s, I think it was. The cast as well, Olivia Hussey, Margot Kidder, I thought was great as foul-mouthed Barb. The cast was really good, and I also think that Bob Clark. It was directed by Bob Clark. This is the guy that went on 9 years later to direct another Christmas film, but called A Christmas Story, which is a family-friendly Christmas film. A complete contrast to Black Christmas. But I think Black Christmas is, I don't know if you'd agree with me here, I think it's actually one of the scariest films in the entire slasher genre.
Oh, I think with merit. I think on that front, most certainly, it's one that it's got something that's worth talking about, and it was unnerving. And the way that ends that it doesn't spoon feed you and give any exploration. Quick question: what's something that you did say earlier with it developing a cult following? Would you think that some of that could unfortunately be part of the two tedious, unnecessary remakes that came about back in 2006 and last year?
There is the possibility of that, yeah. The 2006 remake, less said about that the better. I really didn't like it. I haven't seen the 2019 film and I don't want to.
I did.
But yeah, I think among hardcore horror fans, they know Black Christmas. But yeah, within the mainstream, the original film probably has been visited now because the 2006 film was about as mainstream as you kind of get. So yeah, there is that chance. But the 2019 film, I saw the trailer, not interested. It just looked like a film that was promoting girl power, and it pretty much shows like 99.9% of the movie.
Which the thing is, though, that in itself isn't necessarily a problem. The problem is, I think we said about this, first of all, don't call it Black Christmas. And secondly, it has this tone. I think when watching it, you kind of know what's going on because it's so political. It's so, I guess you could say PC, that it tries to push forward this message. And I'm just like, look, if you didn't call it Black Christmas, fine, okay, maybe I'd be a little bit less, not even unfair, I'd be less harsh about it, but if you're going to call it Black Christmas, at least try to keep with the original.
It just kind of looked like an MTV music video to me. I remember seeing the trailer. They actually show who the killers are in the trailer. If that's not bad marketing, I don't know what is. They actually show the killers. And the thing is, I don't know if Blumhouse had much confidence in this film, because Blumhouse are a studio that like to market their films. Typically, their films get a good dose of marketing. A lot of people did not realise Black Christmas was even coming out. It was only a couple of months or so, 2 or 3 months before the film came out, I even knew the film existed. So I'm just wondering if Blumhouse they probably didn't have much faith in the film.
Based on the financial aspect of it, it didn't necessarily look like it necessarily broke even. It didn't necessarily turn a profit. Yeah. Thankfully.
Well, we're gonna go on to the next one now. We've just got a few more to get through. Now, I believe every other film on this list, they're all the same. We've got the same films now, I think.
Yeah.
Okay, and the next film on the list for me is 1978's Dawn of the Dead. George A. Romero. Certainly, probably the most iconic zombie film of all time. I certainly think it kind of moved zombies kind of into the mainstream. I mean, to me, 1968's Night of the Living Dead, to me, is like the quintessential zombie film. It's my personal favourite. It's the film that really kind of set the template for zombie films to follow. But with Dawn of the Dead, it's kind of like the godfather of zombie films for a lot of people.
Oh my!
It's certainly one of the most popular. What's your take on the movie?
Oh, I absolutely love it. It was my first proper introduction into the zombie genre, and it has brains in it, which is something that you wouldn't necessarily expect. I think that's the genius with George Romero. It is the subject matter, some of the commentary, and some of the aspects of the film that really tap into some of the cultural moments. But you look at Night of the Living Dead, such a countercultural film, and then you go to Dawn of the Dead, which is a beautiful satire on consumerism. It doesn't even have to scream in your face about it. No. It's just showing it so beautifully. And the special effects, are absolutely incredible for a time as well. Some really nasty moments in it as well. However, to paraphrase Roger Ebert, even he said, no one said art had to be in good taste. So I understand that it's not Night of the Living Dead. I know everyone's, the original and best. But Dawn of the Dead, though, I tell you what, that certainly upped the ante in terms of violence, and I love it.
Yeah, top-notch score effects by Tom Savini, who obviously actually appears in the film as a biker as well.
Amazing.
I know that originally he was supposed to do the effects in Night of the Living Dead, but he actually got sent off to Vietnam. But yeah, with Dawn of the Dead, it's a bigger movie, isn't it? It's a bigger film than Night of the Living Dead in terms of its scope and its scale. I love the mall setting, that sense of claustrophobia that the film had. I love the fact that pretty much almost the entire film takes place in that mall. And yeah, I think like Night of the Living Dead, it makes a lot of social commentary, consumerism, etc. I think the original Night of the Living Dead, I had a terrifying experience actually, watching that as a kid. The whole kind of very low budget, black and white, just kind of added to the film's atmosphere. But with Dawn of the Dead, I think that, George A. Romero really kind of found his ground with that film. But I will say on a side note, I actually thought the 2004 remake was actually pretty good.
I think it was perfectly watchable. It doesn't have the same substance, or to be corny, it doesn't have a brain in its head like a Romero's film. However, it's a lot of fun. It was fast. It was very kinetic. The vast majority of the time, proper practical effects, and particularly the director's cut as well. There's a little bit more with the characters. Okay, the characters aren't as likable. However, in terms of contemporary 21st century remakes go, it's a barrel of fun.
Yeah, certainly. Okay, yeah, and that was actually Zack Snyder's directorial debut as well, wasn't it?
Who, needless to say, is, I think, one of the most polarized filmmakers. I know some people love his films, some people who hate his films. However, Dawn of the Dead I'd still rank as one of his better films.
Yep, certainly. Yep, before he started hitting the comic book genre. Okay, now, next film on the list. Now, I know that this is a film you love. I think you love it. I really like it. I think it's a film you love even more than me. And that is 1974's Texas Chainsaw Massacre.
Hell yeah.
I'm going to let you take this one away.
Right, I don't know where to start with this. I think, so, as Barry pointed out in 1974 with Black Christmas, with the proto-slasher, the Texas Chainsaw Massacre helped us to, give earlier sort of formulas to the eventually popularized slash genre. One of the greatest ironies is that Tobe Hooper wanted to minimize the violence so it could have a more accessible rating in America, but but needless to say, its amazing atmosphere and minimalism and focus on terrorization without a explanation to the insanity is something that really terrified audiences. In fact, it was never given a BBFC certificate until 1999. It was technically banned for about 25 years. To quote Mike Garris, who would direct a couple of episodes of Masters of Horror and a couple of the Psycho sequels, he said in Nightmares of Red, White, Blue, it has a level of insanity that feels very real, and you wonder who made this effing movie. And, you know, we have one of the greatest horror icons with Leatherface, a Tobe Hooper, you know, who was another real game changer, who would go on to making things like The Funhouse and Poltergeist, but that's a great area.
There's a whole nother podcast for that one.
However, with all the sequels and the reboots and the remakes, blah blah blah, that came out, they all pretty much missed the point. They missed what made the first film so great. The second film you can make an argument for, but this film, the ultimate irony being is that people thought it was a video nasty in Britain. It wasn't. But let's face it, the sort of power it had, you can't blame people. The amount of films have ripped it off and imitated it. It just shows how much, you know, Tobe Hooper sort of changed the battlefield for horror.
Yeah, Texas Chainsaw Massacre. Yeah, like you said. Yeah, proto slasher. The film has a very raw, visceral quality to it, where it does feel, you know, I believe it was shot on 16mm, wasn't it?
That sounds about right. And it has this documentary aesthetic to it as well, which I think The Last House on the Left had a similar quality to it as well.
Yeah.
But Tobe Hooper was able to make it more effective. In fact, the British Board of Film Censors, Stephen Murphy, at the time, he even commended the film for being well made. It really felt so authentic. It had such a power. And that name, the title. What was its original title?
Head Cheese.
Yeah, to go from Head Cheese to the Texas
ridiculous
Chainsaw
title
Massacre.
Yeah, completely and utterly ridiculous title. Head Cheese. I mean, the Texas Chainsaw Massacre. I mean, the thing is, it's like I said, that film has a raw, kind of unnerving quality to it, a very kind of visceral quality. I mean, the thing is, it's called the Texas Chainsaw Massacre. It heavily implies there's a bloodbath, but there's actually very little in the way of the blood. It's more suggested violence.
And if you talk to some of the audiences who saw it back in '74, they would be going mad over the idea that you saw Franklin, you know, being, you know, cut to shreds in his wheelchair. When you watch, it's like, no, it's so well executed that you think it's. I think Toby said he borrowed some inspiration from Hitchcock's Psycho in terms of making it seem like that you're seeing it, even though it's just very effective editing.
Yeah, it's like you said, great horror creation. Leatherface, played by Gunnar Hansen, Marilyn Burns, who become a bit of a scream queen in that film, who also starred in, I'm pretty certain it was another Tobe Hooper film. I'm sure it was called Eaten Alive.
Death Trap. Two different titles.
Sorry.
Yeah.
Okay,
you're right. It's Eaten Alive. It was also called Eaten Alive, I think, for American audiences, and then it was called Death Trap for British audiences.
Okay, but yeah, Tobe Hooper's best film, and in both of our opinions, one of the best horror films, and certainly one of the most important horror films of the 70s.